Welcome. I'm psychologist Lee Carter. I spend a lot of time in jails, prisons, and juvenile detention. I've studied many youth, ages 10 to 18, who've committed crimes. People often ask me what I've learned from the many thousands of interviews I've conducted in these settings. That's what I want to share with you. In particular, I want to offer you a series of videos outlining lessons I've learned from juvenile offenders, and I want to apply them to everyday life. If you're a parent of a troubled teenager, or if you're an adult who works with teenagers and wants solid tips on how to pull a kid out of the throes of troubled conduct, or if you're hoping to prevent a teenager you know and love from falling into a pattern of self-destruction, I hope you'll find this series to be helpful. Let me make one thing very clear at the outset. When teenagers act out, whether they're merely talking back to you, or if they get into verbal or physical fights or break laws, their exaggerated behavior is telling you something. I want to help you hone what I believe to be the most effective communication and behavior management skill you can develop. Learn to listen well. Mind you, listening involves far more than absorbing the words a teenager says. It involves absorbing everything about the teenager. Here's a brief vignette from a conversation I had with a teenager I once met in juvenile detention. He was there because he and an older brother got into a fight. His charge was aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The deadly weapon was a butter knife, the kind with a round edge and no teeth, but it was an aggravated assault nonetheless. This teenager sat across a table from me and scowled virtually the entire 2 hours I met with him. His hair looked as if it had not been combed in days. He didn't smile at all. When he spoke, his voice waxed and waned between bitter, angry pronouncements and barely audible complaints. When he told me why he was in detention, he simply said, "I've told my brother 1,000 times to watch himself. He doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut. He got what was coming to him, but you can't say I didn't warn him." What was coming was a smashed lip and a cut that required several stitches. Okay, I know you weren't in the room with me, but from the little bit of information I just gave you, what did you hear from this teenager? What did he tell you? Let's name a few things. This teenager was angry. He harbored bitterness toward others, particularly his brother, at least on that particular day. He used his emotions as a weapon in the same way that he used the butter knife as a weapon. He believed that to make a point, he had to pound it home, whether literally or figuratively. He was discouraged. Experience had no doubt taught this teenager that to make nice with people got him absolutely nowhere. This teenager strongly believed he was right and other people were wrong. He felt isolated. He wanted the company of understanding people, but concluded a long time ago that most people don't know what it's like to be him. He was hardened. He put up barriers to keep people at bay, but in so doing, he kept people from helping him. In effect, he had become his own worst enemy. See what I mean when I say listening is such an important communication and behavior management tool? In a matter of only a couple of minutes, this boy said a lot, didn't he? Listening is an art form. It involves much more than simply hearing what another person says. It requires you to step outside your vantage point for a few moments and into the mind and soul of the teenager. That's no easy task. In fact, it's a task I still have to work on daily, even after 36 years in my profession. Okay, have you ever tried to quantify a teenager's emotions? Should we measure it in inches, gallons, tears, number of fights, late night talk sessions, trips to the corner, trips to juvenile detention? Emotions are hard to measure because they're subjective. Some teenagers display their emotions so that the entire world knows what they feel. Others stuff angry or depressed feelings inside while wearing an external smile. Some young people are quite free in expressing feelings of defiance. Others let their feelings simmer and boil. It's hard to know or measure how upset a teenager is. Consider this thought. Teenagers are no different than me or you, including teenagers who display imbalanced emotions and behaviors. In the same way that adults differ in our emotional experiences, so do teenagers. One person rants and raves when upset, while another person knows to cool off before addressing tough issues. One teenager takes life stressors in stride, while another lets daily pressures eat away at the lining of his stomach. There's no single way to depict or quantify human emotions, but there's three important factors to consider when trying to figure out how to help a troubled teenager. Pay attention to these three things. Number one, how the teenager behaves when upset. Number two, how a teenager communicates what he feels. And number three, how a teenager feels about himself in general. Let me ask you to be candidly honest with yourself. When a teenager behaves inappropriately by doing things like becoming too excited or upset over a minor matter, or taking advantage of others, or acting out without thinking about what might happen next, or taking risks that could harm himself or maybe somebody else. When these things happen, do you get hooked into power struggles? Dole out harsh punishments real quickly? Do you ever get in the teenager's face and tell him what you think? Do you purposely try to make the teen feel ashamed? Do you counterattack with sarcasm or verbal threats? What about when a teenager communicates that no one takes him seriously, or he gets so touchy that it's impossible to reason with him, or says something awful like, "I wish I'd never been born"? When you hear that kind of communication from a teenager, do you respond by pointing out the flaws or inconsistencies in his thinking? Do you give well-intentioned lectures? Do you make predictions about what might happen if he keeps on in the path he's going? Or if a teenager shows negative emotions by wearing a sad or angry look all the time, or showing no energy, or if he gripes and complains about every little thing that goes wrong, do you react by feeling discouraged in the role you play in that teenager's life? Do you react by feeling overwhelmed to the point of wanting to give up? Do you react by absorbing guilt for not being able to force the teenager to make changes? My point in asking you to be completely candid about how you react to a troubled teenager is not to create guilt or discouragement. It's simply to point out that learning to listen to a teenager takes practice. Let me repeat once again that listening involves stepping outside your point of view and into the teenager's point of view. Let me leave you with a word of hope. Adults sometimes feel guilty for the emotions and behaviors of the teenagers in their world. Stay away from that trap. In all families, in all social groups, every person plays his or her unique role. One person can't and should not assume responsibility for everything a teenager does. But at the same time, success in relationships with teenagers rises when adults assume the role of healthy leadership. Most often, teenagers respond favorably when adults listen. They like the feeling of being heard and understood. I do, and I know you do too. Lending a listening ear is often the very first step in convincing a teenager to behave more rationally, to communicate more clearly, and to display better balanced emotions. Thus, while adults need not assume the total burden for a teenager's mistakes, effective listening is a powerful tool that tames anger, preventing its destructive power. And in my book, listening is the most important tool for us to keep sharpened. We'll talk more about this when we meet again. I'm psychologist Lee Carter. I'll look forward to being with you again soon.